In 480 BC, the largest army the world had ever seen began moving west. 1 million men. Maybe more. Their target? A tiny alliance of Greek city-states that barely got along. Standing in their way at a narrow mountain pass were just 300 Spartans. But here's what the movies won't tell you: those 300 weren't alone, they weren't planning to die, and the battle that followed would be decided not by warrior skill, but by a single act of betrayal that changed Western civilization forever. This is the true story of Thermopylae. And it's far more complex than you've been told. Let's rewind 10 years. The Persian Empire wasn't just powerful, it was incomprehensibly vast. Stretching from Egypt to India, from the steppes of Central Asia to the Arabian deserts, it controlled more territory and people than any empire before it. When its king, Darius the Great, looked westward at the fractured Greek city-states, he saw something that offended him: defiance. The Greeks had done the unthinkable. They'd supported a rebellion in Ionia, Persian territory on the coast of modern-day Turkey. Then, in 490 BC, when Darius sent an expedition to punish them, a force of Athenians and Plataeans had achieved the impossible at Marathon: they defeated a Persian army on open ground. Darius died before he could take revenge. But his son, Xerxes, inherited both the throne and the grudge. Xerxes wasn't interested in a punitive raid. He wanted total conquest. For 10 years, he prepared. He assembled an invasion force so massive that ancient historians could barely comprehend it. Herodotus, our primary source, claimed over 2 million soldiers and support personnel. Modern historians are more conservative. Probably between 100,000 and 300,000 fighting men, still the largest military force assembled to that point in human history. But numbers weren't Xerxes' only advantage. He brought engineering genius. When the Hellespont Strait blocked his path, Persian engineers built a bridge of boats, the largest pontoon bridge ever constructed, allowing his army to walk from Asia into Europe. When Mount Athos threatened his fleet with treacherous waters, he simply cut a canal through the peninsula. Mountains, seas, nothing would stop him. Meanwhile, in Greece, panic was setting in. The Greek world wasn't a nation. It was a collection of fiercely independent city-states that spent more time fighting each other than cooperating. Athens and Sparta, the two most powerful, had completely different cultures, governments, and values. Athens was a democracy, innovative and intellectual. Sparta was a military oligarchy, conservative and disciplined to the point of brutality. But the Persian threat forced an impossible alliance. In 481 BC, delegates from 31 city-states met at Corinth and did something unprecedented: they agreed to fight together. They called themselves the Hellenic League, and they appointed Sparta's king Leonidas as commander of their combined forces. Leonidas was about 60 years old, ancient for a warrior. But he'd spent his entire life training for war. In Sparta, that training began at age 7, when boys were taken from their families and subjected to the agoge. A brutal education system designed to produce perfect soldiers. Inadequate food to teach resourcefulness. Public beatings to build pain tolerance. Constant combat training. Spartan warriors weren't just skilled, they were psychologically conditioned to view death in battle as the highest honor. But Leonidas knew something that would haunt him: 300 men, even Spartans, couldn't stop Xerxes. The Greek strategy was desperate but logical. They would use geography. Greece is mountainous, crossed by narrow passes that negate numerical superiority. If they could find the right bottleneck and hold it long enough, perhaps the Persian supply lines would collapse. Perhaps the massive invasion fleet would be destroyed by autumn storms. Perhaps. The War Council identified their choke point. Thermopylae. The Hot Gates, named for the thermal springs nearby. It was a coastal pass in central Greece, squeezed between steep mountains and the sea. At its narrowest point, the pass was only about 15 meters wide, just 50 feet. A wagon could barely turn around. This would be where they'd make their stand. But here's the truth the movies miss: Leonidas wasn't planning to die there. He was planning to hold long enough for the main Greek army to mobilize and for the Greek fleet to win the naval war happening simultaneously at nearby Artemisium. The 300 Spartans weren't on a suicide mission. They were the advance guard. But Leonidas was about to discover that battles aren't won by courage alone. They're won by intelligence, logistics, and loyalty. And in the mountains above Thermopylae, a local shepherd was about to make a choice that would doom them all. The storm from the east was coming. And the hot gates were about to live up to their name. When Leonidas arrived at Thermopylae in August of 480 BC, he wasn't commanding just 300 men. He was leading an army of about 7,000. This is the first myth we need to shatter. The 300 Spartans were the elite corps, the personal guard of the king, chosen specifically because each had a living son to carry on his bloodline. But they were joined by roughly 2,800 other Peloponnesians, 1,000 Phocians, 700 Thespians, 400 Thebans, and smaller contingents from other cities. These men don't get movies made about them, but they were there. They fought. Many of them died. So why does history remember only the 300? We'll get to that. But first, you need to understand what Leonidas saw when he surveyed his position. Thermopylae was perfect. Almost. The pass ran roughly east to west along the coast. Mountains rose sharply on the southern side, the Kallidromos range, steep and treacherous. On the northern side, the Malian Gulf. In 480 BC, the sea came much closer to the cliffs than it does today. Centuries of sediment have since pushed the coastline north, but back then, at the narrowest points, an army could only advance maybe 20 men abreast. There was already a defensive wall there, built years earlier by the Phocians to defend against Thessalian raids. It had fallen into disrepair, but Leonidas' men immediately set to work rebuilding it. Stone by stone, they created a barrier across the narrowest section of the pass. Behind this wall, the Greeks would make their stand. But Leonidas had a problem that gnawed at him. The mountains weren't impassable. There was a path, the Anapeia Trail, that wound through the heights above the pass. A small force could use it to circle behind the Greek position. The locals assured him it was treacherous, barely more than a goat track, but it existed. Leonidas posted his 1,000 Phocians up there to guard it. They knew the terrain. They'd hold. Or so he hoped. While the Greeks fortified, the Persian army approached like a slow-moving catastrophe. Imagine you're a Greek scout, positioned on the heights, watching them come. First, you see the dust cloud on the horizon. Then the advance cavalry, thousands strong. Then the infantry, column after column, stretching back so far you can't see the end. The immortals, Persia's elite 10,000, so named because their number never diminished. When one fell, another immediately took his place. Contingents from every corner of the empire, Medes in leather and carrying wicker shields, Egyptians with linen armor, Indians with bamboo bows, Ethiopians wrapped in lion skins. Different weapons. Different armor. Different languages. But all marching west under the banner of the great king. When Xerxes arrived and saw the narrow pass, he didn't immediately attack. He was too smart for that. He'd been advised by Greek exiles in his court. Men who'd fled political persecution in their home cities. They told him about Spartans. About their reputation. About their insane dedication to never retreating. So Xerxes waited 4 days. He sent a mounted scout to observe the Greek position. What the scout reported back must have seemed absurd. The Spartans were outside the wall, exercising. Combing their long hair. Completely relaxed, as if they were preparing for a festival rather than a battle. Some were wrestling. Others were doing calisthenics. When they noticed the Persian scout, they didn't react with alarm, they just ignored him. Xerxes summoned Demaratus, an exiled Spartan king now living at the Persian court. "Explain this to me," Xerxes demanded. Are they mad? Do they not see my army? Demaratus gave him an answer that Xerxes couldn't quite believe. They are preparing to die. It is their custom, when they are about to risk their lives, to attend to their hair. This wasn't bravado. This was Spartan culture laid bare. To them, death in battle wasn't something to fear, it was the entire purpose of life. They'd been raised from childhood with a single phrase drumming into their minds: return with your shield, or on it. Come home victorious, or come home dead. Those were the only acceptable options. But Xerxes still didn't believe a few thousand men would truly stand against him. He sent a herald with an offer: surrender your weapons. Leonidas sent back 3 words that would echo through history: mol and lab. Come and take them. On the 5th day, Xerxes' patience ran out. He sent in his first wave. The Medes and Scythians, tough mountain fighters from what is now Iran, advanced in massive formations. They were brave, well-trained, and completely unprepared for what they were about to face. The Greeks had advantages that weren't immediately obvious. First, their equipment was simply better for this kind of fight. The Persian infantry generally carried lighter wicker shields and shorter spears. They relied on overwhelming numbers and archery. The Greek hoplites had heavy bronze armor, massive wooden shields reinforced with bronze, and spears that were 8 to 10 feet long. In a narrow pass where the Persians couldn't use their numbers, where archery was less effective, the Greek equipment was devastatingly superior. Second, the Spartans had trained their entire lives for exactly this kind of warfare: the phalanx. Shields overlapping, spears presenting an impenetrable wall of bronze and wood, each man protecting the soldier to his left. It required incredible discipline. If one man broke formation, the entire line could collapse. But Spartans didn't break. The first Persian assault crashed against the Greek line like a wave against a cliff. The pass was so narrow that thousands of Persian soldiers became a liability. They couldn't all fight at once, and those in the back pressed those in the front forward into the Greek spears. It was a killing zone. The Spartans employed a tactic that must have seemed like madness to the Persians. They would pretend to retreat, drawing the enemy forward in a disorganized rush. Then they'd suddenly turn and reform their phalanx, catching the pursuing Persians off guard and slaughtering them. By the end of the first day, the ground was slick with blood, and the Persians had achieved exactly nothing. They'd lost thousands of men. The Greeks had barely lost any. Xerxes, watching from his throne, reportedly jumped to his feet 3 times in alarm at what he was witnessing. But the Persian king had something the Greeks didn't: an inexhaustible supply of men. And somewhere in the mountains, a traitor was making his way toward the Persian camp, ready to sell information that would doom the defenders. The killing had only just begun. On the 2nd day, Xerxes played his trump card. He sent in the immortals. These weren't ordinary soldiers. They were the Persian Empire's special forces, 10,000 of the most skilled warriors in the known world, personally loyal to the great king. They wore scaled armor that glittered in the sun, carried spears tipped with silver or gold pomegranates, and maintained a reputation of invincibility that had been earned through decades of conquest. If anyone could break the Greek line, it would be them. They couldn't. The physics of Thermopylae were simply unbeatable. The immortals were magnificent warriors, but they were designed for open-field warfare where their mobility and tactical flexibility could shine. Crammed into a narrow pass, unable to maneuver, unable to flank, they died just as easily as the Medes had the day before. The Greek spears were longer. The Greek armor was thicker. The Greek shields were bigger. And the Greeks had nowhere to retreat to, which meant they fought with the desperate energy of men who knew running wasn't an option. Ancient sources claim that Leonidas himself was in the thick of the fighting, not commanding from the rear like most kings, but right there in the front line, his red cloak visible through the chaos. This was the Spartan way. Lead from the front. Share the danger. By midday on the 2nd day, the pass was becoming difficult to navigate. Bodies were piled so high that soldiers were literally climbing over corpses to reach the enemy. The smell would have been overwhelming: blood, sweat, voided bowels, the metallic tang of bronze. The sounds would have been deafening: screaming men, clashing metal, orders shouted in a dozen languages. The Spartans rotated their front lines with mechanical precision. Fresh men would step forward while exhausted warriors stepped back to rest, drink water, tend minor wounds. The other Greek contingents followed the Spartan example. It was brutal, efficient, and it was working. Xerxes watched his elite guard get shredded and realized the horrifying truth: he couldn't win this way. Not in any timeline that made sense. He could throw men at the pass for weeks and only achieve a mountain of his own dead. The Greeks were outnumbered, but they'd found the one place where numbers didn't matter. He needed another way through. And that's when Ephialtes arrived. Ephialtes was a local Greek from Malis, the region around Thermopylae. Ancient sources describe him as deformed, possibly a hunchback, which might have prevented him from serving in the Greek forces. Modern historians debate whether this physical description is true or just a literary device to match his moral deformity. But what's certain is this: he knew about the Anapeia trail through the mountains, and he wanted Persian gold more than he valued Greek freedom. Under cover of darkness on the second night, Ephialtes made his way to Xerxes' tent. Through interpreters, he explained that there was a mountain path that could bypass the Greek position entirely. It was narrow and treacherous, but passable. A force could climb through the night and emerge behind the Greek lines by morning. Xerxes immediately understood the value of this intelligence. He summoned Hydarnes, commander of the Immortals, and gave him explicit orders. Take the path, circle behind the Greeks, trap them between two forces. Finally, the nightmare at the pass would end. As the sun set on the second day, Hydarnes led his Immortals, still bloodied from their failed assault earlier, up into the mountains. They carried torches to light their way, winding single file along a trail that was indeed barely more than a goat track. The night was moonless. One wrong step could send a man tumbling down a cliff. But the promise of vengeance and their king's favor drove them forward. The path wound through ancient oak forests, across streams, up rocky inclines. And it was supposed to be guarded. Around midnight, the Phocian guards posted on the heights heard something. The rustle of thousands of feet through fallen leaves. At first, they must have hoped it was animals, deer, perhaps, moving through the forest. But then they saw the torchlight through the trees. An army was coming. The Phocians were brave men. They'd volunteered for this isolated, dangerous duty. But they weren't Spartans. They hadn't spent their entire lives training for impossible odds. When they realized the size of the force coming toward them, thousands of the Persian Empire's best warriors, they made a decision that would haunt Greek military history. They retreated to higher ground to make their stand, moving off the path itself. It was a tactically sound decision if their goal was survival. By moving to the heights, they could defend a stronger position. But it had one catastrophic consequence: they left the path open. Hydarnes, seeing the Phocians retreating uphill, made an instant calculation. His orders were to get behind the Greek main force, not to fight every isolated guard unit. He left a small contingent to keep the Phocians pinned down with arrows and kept moving with the bulk of his force. The Phocians, raining stones and javelins down from above, killed some Persians, but not enough, and not the ones that mattered. By the time the Phocians sent a runner racing down the mountain to warn Leonidas, Hydarnes was already past them, moving toward the rear of the Greek position. The messenger arrived at the Greek camp just before dawn. Leonidas received the news with the kind of cold clarity that defines great commanders facing impossible situations. He immediately understood what it meant: they were about to be surrounded. Within hours, Persian forces would be attacking from both the front and rear. The defensive position that had made victory possible was about to become a death trap. He called a council of war. The allied commanders debated frantically. Some argued they should all retreat immediately while they still could. Others suggested they should all stay and die together. The argument grew heated as the sky began to lighten. Leonidas made the decision for them. Most of the army would withdraw. The Peloponnesians who had families and cities to protect would live to fight another day. This battle was lost, but the war wasn't over. Greece would need every soldier for what was coming next. But the Spartans would stay. Why? The ancient sources give several explanations. Some say an oracle had prophesied that either Sparta would fall or a Spartan king must die. Others say that Spartan law simply forbade retreat, that to return home defeated was a dishonor worse than death. Modern historians suggest more practical reasons. Someone needed to hold the pass long enough for the rest of the army to escape, and the Spartans were the best qualified for a delaying action. The truth is probably all of these things at once. As dawn broke on the third day, most of the Greek army began withdrawing south. But the 300 Spartans remained. And with them stayed the 700 Thespians, volunteers who refused to leave, and 400 Thebans, though ancient sources suggest the Thebans were kept there against their will. Roughly 1,100 men, watching as their comrades disappeared down the road. Knowing what was coming, Leonidas gathered his Spartans and spoke words that Herodotus would later record: "Eat a good breakfast, men. Tonight we dine in Hades." They weren't planning to retreat. They weren't planning to surrender. They were planning to kill as many Persians as possible before the inevitable end. The final act was about to begin, and it would be written in blood. Dawn on the third day broke with a beauty that mocked what was about to happen. The sea glittered. The mountains stood silent. And 1,100 men prepared to die. But here's what makes this day so remarkable: they didn't wait for death to come to them. They attacked. Leonidas knew that Hydarnes and his immortals were somewhere in the mountains behind him, probably hours away from emerging to complete the encirclement. He had a window, narrow and closing fast, to inflict maximum damage on the Persian army. And if he was going to die today, he'd make Xerxes pay such a steep price that every king in history would think twice before invading Greece again. The Spartans abandoned the wall they'd defended for 2 days. They marched out into the wider part of the pass, where they'd have room to maneuver, where they could meet the Persians in open combat. It was tactically insane and psychologically brilliant. The defenders were attacking. The Persian front lines, expecting another defensive stand at the wall, were completely unprepared for a Greek assault. The Spartans crashed into them like a bronze wave, spears driving forward, shields smashing, voices raised in their battle cry. They weren't fighting to hold ground anymore. They were fighting to kill. Ancient sources describe the carnage in terms that strain credibility, but the archaeological evidence backs up the horror of it. The Spartans' longer spears gave them reach advantage. Their heavier armor made them nearly invulnerable to the lighter Persian weapons. And their absolute lack of fear, men who knew they were already dead, gave them a psychological edge that's hard to quantify but impossible to deny. The Persian soldiers weren't cowards. They'd conquered most of the known world. But there's something uniquely terrifying about fighting men who aren't trying to survive, who are only trying to take you with them. The Persians began to break. Not all at once, but in ripples. Units would collapse, fall back, create gaps in the line that the Spartans exploited ruthlessly. Xerxes, watching from his throne on a hill overlooking the battle, sent wave after wave forward. He had the men to spare. But each wave bought him nothing except more bodies. The historical accounts claim that Persian soldiers were being driven into the sea, literally forced off the coastal edge of the pass by the press of their own retreating comrades and the advancing Spartans. And then Leonidas fell. We don't know exactly how it happened. Ancient accounts differ. Some say he was struck by arrows. Others claim he died from spear thrusts while fighting hand to hand. What's certain is that sometime during the mid-morning assault, the Spartan king went down. What happened next reveals something profound about Spartan psychology. When their king fell, they didn't break. They didn't panic. They formed a circle around his body and fought with even greater ferocity than before. To lose their king's body to the enemy was unthinkable, a dishonor that would echo through generations. For times the Persians tried to take Leonidas' corpse. For times they were driven back. The fight over the fallen king became a battle within the battle, a savage, personal struggle that devolved into hand-to-hand combat with swords, daggers, even fists and teeth when weapons broke. 2 of Xerxes' own brothers died in this melee, cut down by Spartans who were fighting not for Greece or for glory, but for the simple, primal duty to protect their king's body. Meanwhile, Hydarnes and the Immortals had emerged from the mountain pass behind the Greek position. The trap was closing. The Spartans received word that the Persians were behind them. They pulled back from their assault, carrying Leonidas' body, and retreated to a small hill within the pass, later called the Kolonos Hill. It was barely more than a mound, but it gave them slight elevation, and that would have to be enough. They formed a defensive circle. By now, many of their spears were broken. Their shields were shattered. They were wounded, exhausted, and completely surrounded by an army that outnumbered them hundreds to one. The Thebans, according to Herodotus, broke ranks at this point and surrendered to the Persians with hands raised, proclaiming they'd been forced to stay. Xerxes branded them with the royal mark, a punishment and humiliation, but spared their lives. Modern historians debate whether this account is accurate or Athenian propaganda against a rival city-state. We'll never know for certain. But the Spartans and Thespians didn't surrender. They fought on. The Persians, having learned their lesson about close combat with Spartans, didn't rush the hill. Instead, Xerxes gave an order that was both pragmatic and cowardly: surround them and use arrows. Thousands of arrows. Tens of thousands. So many that Herodotus records a Spartan named Dionysus making a joke before the battle. When told that Persian arrows would be so numerous they'd block out the sun, he replied, "Good, then we'll fight in the shade." Now that prophecy came true in the most terrible way possible. The sky literally darkened with arrows. The Spartans raised their battered shields, trying to create a protective shell, but it was hopeless. Arrows found gaps in armor, penetrated shields that were already damaged from 2 days of combat, struck men who had no more strength to defend themselves. One by one, they fell. There was no dramatic final charge. No last heroic moment. Just men dying under a rain of arrows, their bodies bristling with shafts, their blood soaking into the Greek earth they'd sworn to defend. When the arrows finally stopped and Persian soldiers cautiously approached the hill, they found only corpses. Not a single Spartan or Thespian had survived. The Battle of Thermopylae was over. The Persians had won. The pass was open. The road to Athens lay before them. But as Xerxes walked among the Greek dead, counting the cost of his victory, he began to understand that something had gone terribly wrong. His military advisors tallied the casualties: 20,000 Persian dead, possibly more. 3 days to advance through a narrow pass against a force that should have been swept aside in hours. And when Xerxes found Leonidas' body among the fallen, he made a decision that revealed his rage and frustration. He ordered the Spartan king beheaded and his head mounted on a spike, a desecration that violated Persian customs and showed just how much this victory had actually cost. The Greeks had lost the battle. But they'd bought something priceless: time. And they'd sent a message that would echo through the Persian ranks for the rest of the campaign. The Greeks would not break. They would not bend. They would make every inch of their homeland cost blood. And that would make all the difference. In the immediate aftermath of Thermopylae, it looked like the sacrifice had been for nothing. The Persian army poured through the pass like a flood through a broken dam. They swept south into central Greece, burning and destroying everything in their path. The city of Thespiae was razed to the ground, punishment for the 700 who'd stayed with Leonidas. Athens itself was evacuated, its citizens fleeing to the island of Salamis and the Peloponnese. When Persian soldiers entered the empty city, they burned the Acropolis, destroyed the temples, and left the birthplace of democracy in ruins. From any rational military perspective, Thermopylae was a defeat. The Greeks had lost the pass. They'd lost their king. They'd failed to stop the invasion. Xerxes was exactly where he wanted to be, in control of most of Greece, his army intact, his fleet supporting him from the sea. But something strange was happening in the Persian camp. A psychological rot was setting in. 20,000 dead to kill 1,100 men. The number haunted Xerxes' commanders. If a tiny force of Greeks could inflict such casualties in favorable terrain, what would happen when the Persians faced the full Greek army? Every pass, every valley, every defensive position in Greece suddenly looked like another potential Thermopylae. The confidence that had carried the Persian army across the Hellespont was cracking. And the Greeks knew exactly what they'd accomplished. Even as they retreated, even as they watched their cities burn, they understood that Thermopylae had been a strategic victory disguised as a tactical defeat. The 3-day delay had allowed the Greek fleet to evacuate Athens. It had given the Peloponnesian cities time to fortify the Isthmus of Corinth. Most importantly, it had proven something that had been theoretical before: Greeks could beat Persians. Not just at Marathon, not just once, but consistently, when the circumstances were right. The real payoff came barely a week later at Salamis. The Greek fleet, commanded by the Athenian Themistocles, lured the Persian navy into the narrow straits between Salamis and the mainland, another choke point where numbers didn't matter. Using the same principles Leonidas had employed at Thermopylae, the Greeks destroyed nearly 2/3 of the Persian fleet in a single day. Xerxes watched the destruction from a golden throne on the shore. He'd lost his naval superiority. Without control of the sea, he couldn't supply his massive army through the winter. He made the decision that would doom the entire invasion: he would return to Persia with most of his forces, leaving a smaller army under his general Mardonius to finish the conquest in the spring. But the Greeks had changed. Thermopylae and Salamis had proven they could win. The following year, at Plataea, a united Greek army commanded by the Spartan regent Pausanias met Mardonius' force in open battle. The Spartans, still burning with the shame and glory of Thermopylae, fought with such ferocity that they shattered the Persian lines. Mardonius was killed. His army was routed. The invasion was over. Greece was saved. And Thermopylae was the turning point. But why? Why did 1,100 men dying in a mountain pass change the course of Western civilization? The answer isn't just military. It's cultural and philosophical. If Persia had conquered Greece in 480 BC, the intellectual revolution happening in Athens would have been snuffed out. There would be no Socrates questioning everything. No Plato exploring justice and reality. No Aristotle categorizing the natural world. The foundations of Western philosophy, science, and democracy would never have been laid, or would have developed completely differently under Persian rule. Greek theater, which would give us tragedy and comedy as art forms, gone. Greek mathematics and geometry, never developed to their full potential. Greek medicine, Greek architecture, Greek concepts of citizenship and political participation, all would have been absorbed into the Persian Empire and transformed into something unrecognizable. This isn't to say Persian culture was inferior, it was sophisticated and advanced in its own right. But it was fundamentally different. And the specific combination of Greek rationalism, democratic experimentation, and philosophical inquiry that emerged in the decades after the Persian Wars created the intellectual DNA of Western civilization. Thermopylae made that possible. Not because the Spartans won, but because they held long enough for Greece to organize its defense, and because their sacrifice became a rallying cry that united fractious city-states into an effective alliance. The ancient Greeks understood the significance immediately. They erected monuments at Thermopylae. The most famous was a stone lion, a symbol of Leonidas' name, which means lion-like, placed on the Kolonos hill where the Spartans made their final stand. At the base, they inscribed an epitaph written by the poet Simonides. The most famous lines, meant for the Spartans specifically, read: "Go tell the Spartans, stranger passing by, that here, obedient to their laws, we lie. It's simple. Almost understated. But it captures the essence of what made Sparta simultaneously admirable and disturbing. These men didn't die for freedom in the way we might understand it. Sparta was hardly a free society. They died for duty, for law, for the state. They were products of a brutal military culture that modern people would find horrifying in many ways. But in that specific moment, facing that specific threat, their particular brand of unflinching courage was exactly what Greece needed. The other Greeks who died there got their own epitaph. Here 4,000 from the Peloponnese once fought against 3 million. The numbers are exaggerated, propaganda always is, but the sentiment is real. They were outnumbered. They knew it. They stood anyway. So why do we only remember the 300? Partly because Sparta had the best public relations in the ancient world, they cultivated their warrior mystique carefully. Partly because the image of 300 men against an empire is more dramatically appealing than 7,000. And partly because the Spartans were the only ones who were ordered to stay, who couldn't leave even if they'd wanted to, who embodied total commitment. But the truth is more complex and, in some ways, more inspiring. Thermopylae wasn't just about Spartan discipline. It was about the 700 Thespians who volunteered to stay knowing they'd die. It was about the Phocians guarding a mountain path. It was about thousands of Greek soldiers from dozens of cities choosing to stand together against impossible odds. The legacy of Thermopylae isn't really about 300 men. It's about the principle they represented. That free people, fighting for their homes, can resist tyranny even when tyranny seems overwhelming. That courage and sacrifice can buy time for democracy to survive. That sometimes, a defensive stand against impossible odds is worth making, even if victory is impossible, because the act of resistance itself changes everything. Throughout history, whenever people have faced overwhelming invasion, occupation, or oppression, they've looked back to Thermopylae. The defenders of the Alamo referenced it. British soldiers holding the line at Rorke's Drift drew inspiration from it. The epitaph at Thermopylae has been adapted and quoted in conflicts from World War I to the present day. Why does this one battle, this one defeat, continue to resonate 25 centuries later? Because Thermopylae is about more than tactics and casualties. It's about the moment when ordinary people, flawed, mortal, sometimes cruel and always complicated, choose to stand for something larger than themselves. Not because they're sure they'll win. Not because victory is even possible. But because some lines, once drawn, cannot be uncrossed without losing something essential about what it means to be human. The Spartans and Thespians who died at Thermopylae saved Western civilization. Not in the mythological sense of 300 supermen holding back an infinite horde. But in the real, historical sense of buying 3 days that turned into weeks that turned into a Greek victory that preserved the intellectual and cultural foundation of everything that would come after. When Xerxes finally ordered Leonidas' body desecrated, mounting his head on a spike, he thought he was demonstrating Persian power. But the image of the Spartan king's defiant corpse became another symbol, proof that even in death, even in defeat, the Greeks remained unconquered in spirit. Xerxes would return to Persia humiliated. He'd never again attempt to conquer Greece. The Persian Empire would decline, eventually falling to Alexander the Great, himself a product of Greek culture. A little over a century later. And the narrow pass at Thermopylae, where the hot springs still bubble from the earth, became sacred ground. A place where duty, sacrifice, and courage had intersected with history and changed the world. The movies get a lot wrong about Thermopylae. The numbers. The tactics. The reasons. But they get one thing absolutely right, something extraordinary happened there. Something worth remembering. Something that still has the power, across 25 centuries, to make us ask ourselves what we would do in that narrow pass, with the enemy coming, with no hope of survival, with only the choice between standing or running. The 300 Spartans, and the thousands who stood with them, answered that question in a way that still echoes. They stood. And in standing, They gave the world a gift we're still living with today. That's the truth behind the 300. That's the story the movies didn't tell you. And that's why we still remember their names.